Well, I've been waiting and nobody seems interested. So I'm just going to go ahead and go live. If you're still interested in joining me, uh, please feel free. I don't know how long this will be. I just had some thoughts after my conversation with Trey Jadlow yesterday, and we even had a little after show thing. But one of the things that I think often doesn't get discussed enough in the great debate community. Shoot, I've got my feed. There we go. Okay, no more echo. Anyhow, the the issue of justice, and by that, um, I'm specifically talking about trying to map um, biblical justice to kind of Western democratic justice, the justice that we kind of see and expect to see, I guess, in Western democracies and in our cultures in general. So this is really one of the most powerful from my experiences. Um, it really shifted my perspective on the Bible and democracy in general. Um, I was always raised and taught that uh, the United States was founded on Judeo-Christian principles. Um, in some cases, I was taught, or in some venues and things, there were some teachers in my church and things who told us how all of the founders were believers and dedicated, faithful people. Well, I found out, as I kind of went along and looked into things a bit more, that wasn't true. There were some who were certainly dedicated Christians and believers. Some of them had doctrines that the church I was raised in might disagree with or balk at. There were maybe some Calvinists and things. Others that might have aligned more. But then there were some who, like Benjamin Franklin, were deists. There was Thomas Jefferson, who might have identified himself as a Christian, but did not believe that Jesus was divine. He believed that he was just kind of an inspirational moral teacher, and cut out portions of the Bible that he felt were had supernatural significance, or he didn't believe that any of the miracles really happened. He didn't believe in the resurrection from the dead, and basically just kind of liked the moral teachings from the New Testament. So there's really no church that would identify itself as Christian today that I think would, certainly not Orthodox Christian, that would embrace Thomas Jefferson's view. And and then, so I accepted those ideas and thought about them, and I said, well, so what? So some of the founding fathers weren't 100% aligned with the doctrinal teachings and things that I grew up with. But as I kind of studied more, as I went through college, I took some classes on kind of the development of basically the history of ideas and the development of different ideas about social justice and government and things. I read some Rousseau and some Locke, and various other Enlightenment thinkers, and I realized that a lot of their writings were really very, very much more influential than anything from the Bible. And when I tried to see, well, what kinds of principles from the Bible might be able to be retrofit to the Constitution in the U.S. or the idea of the Magna Carta in the UK. It was really very hard. There were some scriptures and some verses that that I kind of got excited about. So, um, what is it? I think it's in the book of Micah. I'm going to Google it real quick. I probably should have had this pulled up, but I was kind of hoping that people would jump in here and help me out. So if you're watching, yeah, I think it's Micah 6:8. Yeah. So depending on the translation, it basically says, you know what God wants from you, and it is to act justly, or to carry out justice, and love and mercy, and walk humbly with God. I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. Justice. What is that? And so that was one of the things that really kind of sparked my excitement. And as I pursued the idea of justice and the idea of how to map my faith onto what I believed was an overall good system. I mean, I in all this time, I never came to a point where I said, well, the American system is certainly inferior to some other kind of political system, or just kind of the idea of the Western democracy with codified list of rights and things. That has always been appealing to me, and I was taught that that was based out of Judeo-Christian principles. One of the other things that I found very compelling and helped instill an excitement about my faith, and how I kind of thought, well, this has to be right, was when I read John Rawls. And I mentioned this in the hangout that I had, the conversation that I had with Trey Jadlow last night, that John Rawls' theory of justice really is predicated on the idea of reciprocity. So do unto others as you'd have them do to you. If you haven't looked up John Rawls, and you haven't looked into his theory of justice at all, I highly recommend it. It's, even if you end up thinking that it's complete crap, it's worth knowing about, if for no other reason than because it's really been profoundly influential in the political realm today. So, but anyhow, John Rawls wrote that you should kind of picture yourself in what he calls an original position. So you extract yourself kind of hypothetically in a thought experiment from society, so that you won't know if you would land when after you make your laws and your rules. You might be a man, you might be a woman, you might be rich or poor, you might be whatever kind of ethnicity. You would have an equal chance to be to land in the society, in any kind of demographic or religious beliefs and things like that. So you should do your best to craft your laws in a way that you would think are fair, no matter who you kind of ended up being, no matter which demographic you fell into. And this is really a key thing. He describes it as being behind a veil of ignorance with regard to your final position in the society. And he bases this on the development of game theory, the idea that when we play a game, we want the rules to apply equally to all the different players. We want everybody to have kind of an equal chance, even though we understand that there will be winners and losers, and there will be some disparity in skill levels and things like that. But overall, we want things to be just generally fair. And this is one way to do that, because when we start a game, we don't necessarily know, who's going to be the winner or who's going to be the loser. We don't know where we're going to land within the kind of the realm of the game, so to speak. But this whole idea, the fact that it was based on the idea of reciprocity, really struck a note with me. Number one, the whole concept of this theory of justice really rang true to me, because I thought, well, that's it in a nutshell. That's how you craft fair and just laws, is by applying this theory whenever you create laws and rules. And you want there to be limited government. You want there to be accountability and kind of checks and balances within the governmental structure. You also want laws that are not going to unduly favor one group of people over another group of people. And that just really gripped me in a way. And I was also excited as a young believer, because I understood, well, Jesus taught, do unto others as you'd have them do to you, love your neighbor as yourself. This seemed like a really great way to apply that. And in the past, those ideas had been interpreted in a different way, where the person that was trying to apply the principle of reciprocity didn't place himself behind kind of a veil of ignorance. He would say, well, this is fair, and I know that it's fair because I know what truth is, and as a Christian, I can say that everybody should respect the Pope if you were Catholic and you were making the rules, or everybody should follow the teachings of the Protestant Church, or Calvin, or what have you. So they would give very special and kind of dominant place for their beliefs, because they were true. They were the right ones. They had it, and everybody else was wrong. And in the end, the people who were wrong would ultimately be grateful for being forced into accepting these other people's beliefs, because they were their beliefs were wrong, and the people in power were the people who were right, and God put them into power because of that. Right? That's how they got there. And I guess just ignore the fact that in Germany the Lutherans were in power, and in other parts the Anglicans were in power, and in some places the Catholics were in power. So God puts all of those people in power because they're all right, apparently, within their own kingdoms, I guess. Well, so that the kind of the genius of the American system, and later on is that idea spread of this kind of this separation of the church and state. We were able to say, okay, the government shouldn't be involved in determining the winners and the losers. But that was kind of one of the first steps that I started to say, well, okay, can you really get that from the Bible? And I, the kind of the move that I made was, well, the Holy Spirit is supposed to be a gentleman. He doesn't force people. This whole idea of like when Columbus came over, baptizing the natives just before they were slaughtered and things like that. Those things were clearly, in my mind, not right. They were corruptions, and it was God's intent to allow everybody to choose freely and openly, and that's why we have religious freedom. So that's kind of how I played that one. What about freedom of speech? Because the Bible definitely, from what I read, certainly in the Old Testament, was not about freedom of speech. Honor your father and mother, uh, and if you don't, you can be stoned to death. Observe the Sabbath, or you can be stoned to death. Well, it kind of gives you some trouble with regard to freedom of religion. Have no other gods before me. Well, that certainly doesn't work very well with freedom of religion, nor with freedom of speech. You can go down the list. There are very few Old Testament laws or commands that really were manifest in the American system of government and law. Don't murder was certainly one, and don't steal. But that wasn't unique to Christian societies, and I understood that. As it turned out, really Thomas Hobbes and John Locke were involved in trying to wrap their minds around what is natural, what would be the natural state for man, and also what is man's kind of nature ultimately. Are we ultimately good? Are we evil? Are we some combination of those things? And through those thought experiments, talking about, are native peoples more peaceful? Are they corrupt? Do they fight? Looking at these things, they kind of took it as a sociological thought experiment, and then tried to extrapolate from those thoughts, and also just from the new explorations that were coming about, and that had been done. Western society in Europe had branched into Africa. They'd started looking around and exploring in the Americas. They'd heard some reports back, and some reports were more accurate than others about what was happening. But they were using these reports from explorations around the world and societies that had more structured societies versus societies that were a bit more, I don't know what's the word. They were more hunter-gatherer societies with much more loosely constructed social constructs, I suppose. And but anyhow, they really tried to develop systems around those ideas and around their conceptions of what man's nature was like. They weren't reflecting on necessarily on the Bible or Scripture. They were reflecting on what they had heard about these primitive societies, or quote unquote primitive societies. They were reflecting on what they knew from their own history, from the history of Europe, and what was appeared to be working in some circumstances, where if there were some elected people rather than just appointed, that things might work out better. If the people had a say in their government, things tended to be a little bit better. They would accept things if they felt like they were able to contribute. They also looked back at systems of government that were what's the word? Innovative, I suppose, from the Greeks and the Romans and their early systems of democracy. And they decided, well, maybe we need to give this another go. And when those ideas kind of churned around and got circulated and talked about, they spread and became popular. When you get to Thomas Paine in the early American, kind of pre-revolutionary days, Common Sense, and some of his pamphlets. Well, Thomas Paine was I believe, a deist. So he wasn't interested necessarily in the Bible, and some of his writings, like the Age of Reason, pretty much condemns outright organized religion, both. Well, he condemns Christianity as much as he does Islam and Judaism as well, and says, anytime that you are taking someone else's report of hearing from a deity, you're basically being gullible. Unless you hear it firsthand yourself from the deity, you should be skeptical, is what his argument in a nutshell in The Age of Reason is. But he advances this idea of rebelling, that we have a moral duty to rebel against the government. Well, that whole idea, and this was, when I started to think about the idea of rebelling against the government, and how that was carried out in the American Revolution, that really struck me as very, very much anti what the New Testament teaches, for sure, and really the Old Testament too. But Paul and Jesus both teach that you should render to Caesar what is Caesar's, obey the laws of the land, and accept the authority that God has placed in front of you. So that really rocked my boat with regard to what I was taught, because I could not in any way take those passages, those scriptures that said, obey your masters to the slaves. If you have an authority over you, it's been put there by God, and you shouldn't be rebellious. Don't be rebellious. This is the theme in the New Testament, and respect authority. I couldn't square that with the idea of the revolting and going to war, and also the example set by kind of the early believers in the church, the New Testament Christians, in the book of Acts, and then just even through church history, in the first century, in the second century, they were persecuted, and they were martyrs, because they wanted their expression to be love. This is another thing that I was taught, but yet on the other hand, I was also taught, well, the American Revolution was a good thing from the perspective of Christianity and the Bible and things, and this was what God ordained, that the America should revolt. And when I brought these things up to other people in the church, sometimes it got shrugged off. In one case, with my mom, who I often went to with some of these problems and puzzles, and when I was growing up, her answers were satisfying to me, but kind of as I grew older and learned a bit more about history and things like that, sometimes the questions that I brought to her, I think, maybe stumped her a bit more. And this was one where she laughed it off, and she said, "Whoa, should we still just be run by the Queen of England? And what alternative do we have?" Well, there are other countries clearly that have had breaks from the rule of the British, that didn't necessarily come to blows or have large rebellions and revolutions. Our friends to the north in Canada are an example, and India is another example. So they were able to change their control and gain control of their own countries without running around killing a bunch of people. And to me, that whole idea seemed counter to the teachings of in the New Testament. I couldn't find anything in the Bible related to this idea of like the Bill of Rights or any examples of natural rights. All of those ideas came from thinkers like Locke and Paine and other Enlightenment thinkers, and they were based on this idea of natural rights, that humans should have rights. They should be given rights, and they are rights that the government does not have an authority to curtail or cut off. So there wasn't a place in the Bible where I could find those things. And there were places in the Bible that seemed to be against those ideas of human rights or natural rights of that kind. Paul says, don't demand your rights. And when Jesus was taken, and stood trial, he didn't demand his rights. He didn't demand to have a lawyer. He stood there and took it when accusations were thrown at him, and he didn't stand up. He wasn't defiant, and those were kind of the examples. So it's hard to say. So I still was kind of clinging to this idea that maybe this idea of reciprocity, maybe that golden rule ethic, still I could pull that out and say, well, that's got a strong foundation in justice, or for a system of justice that really makes sense and really rings true to me. But it was at this time I'd kind of come through college. I still was a believer. My faith and my perspective on the Bible and on our government and our system had certainly changed some, but I still had faith that there was a God, that it was the God of the Bible, and that he was intending to provide salvation to the world through the death and resurrection of Jesus. So I still clung to those ideas, but still had questions, and I was pursuing the answers. And it was around this time, I think, that my brother Turtle 2080 on G+ here is what his handle is. But he sent me an email one day, just kind of out of the blue from my perspective, and said, well, how do you still maintain these beliefs? How do you reconcile this? And we had an exchange, and I did my best to answer him point by point, but it got me thinking, and and I started to kind of look back, and I said, well, I've focused so much on kind of New Testament writings. Let me go back and start reading through the Old Testament again. I found, that one scripture in Micah chapter 6, verse 8 that talked about justice. I had read some other Christian authors that I kind of identified with because they tended to be on the political left more than my kind of what I'd been raised to believe was right in the with regard to politics and a Christian worldview and things. And I'd certainly slid toward the political left in studying and learning about history and things. So as I was reading through these authors, they would point out passages like that and say, well, justice is right, and we know that people should have rights. but nobody really delved into this kind of deficit of support for that in the Bible. Then when I went back and started looking through the Old Testament, I really had trouble, because that whole idea of reciprocity was pretty much wiped out in the Old Testament. It's I believe that there is, you can find do to others as you'd have them do to you in the Old Testament. I think there's like a passage that's gives the equivalent of that in Leviticus somewhere, but it's lost in a sea of other just terrible laws regarding slavery, regarding women's rights, and then you go through the narratives, in the book of Judges and Joshua, in this accounts of the kings in First and Second Samuel and First and Second Kings, and First and Second Chronicles. Really, things get really rough and really ugly, and you just want to. I couldn't make it out. I couldn't say reciprocity is being applied here in any way, shape, or form, and nor do the laws, and in a lot of cases the decisions, the punishments that are meted out to people who supposedly violated the laws, they didn't seem fair or just, and I, at this time, I really wanted things to either make sense in some way, or to I was ready to just kind of toss it out if it wasn't true at this stage, and I wanted it to be. I wanted the truth. If the Bible was true, if the God of the Bible was real, and if there was any good reason at all to maintain these kinds of beliefs, well, I wanted to have the reasons, and if they weren't there, I was ready to just say, okay, that's it. And that's when I came. I at this time I was kind of shopping around. I became disillusioned with a lot of the churches that I was in, for a variety of reasons, and I started to kind of shop around, just looking for something. And there was a church that had a Sunday school class for adults, and they were studying the stories of Achan, the story of David, kind of side by side. And Achan, if you're interested, is in the book of Joshua. You could just do a Google search and look it up, but he's basically a peon. And as you read through the story, unless you are willing to just completely set aside any amount of skepticism, and approach it from an objective point of view, it's pretty clear that Achan is a scapegoat for the leader of the Hebrews at the time, who was Joshua, and his military blunder. He sent in an attack to wipe out this community that was in the way, and his troops got routed. He finds somebody that broke a rule that wasn't even a universal rule from one place to another. Joshua made determinations about whether or not they could. Hey, Gary.
Hey there, Ben.
They made determinations about whether or not they could observe, the right to steal from the people that they had conquered, or take the possessions as their own. In this case, it wasn't allowed. And Joshua took it out on Achan brutally. He not only had Achan stoned to death, but he had his whole family stoned to death. And then juxtapose that with the story of David and Bathsheba, where David breaks several rules that are universal and are even observed today. That he cheated on his spouse. He conspired to have a man killed. Um, and used his position of power to kind of carry out this whole deception and plot to kill somebody that was loyal to him. He's just a real dirtbag, but he didn't even lose the throne, nor did his descendants lose the throne. So, looking at these two narratives side by side and trying to say, well, was justice done? And then, I took it kind of outside of that context and said, well, if there was a similar juxtaposition of two things that happened in our society today, would I accept those as just? And I absolutely not. Like if Barack Obama had somebody killed with his whole family because he stole from one of the Al Qaeda or something like that, that they had killed, and then turned around and had slept with a woman and tried to cover it up and things, people would be absolutely outraged if he wasn't booted out of the office immediately. If he carried on the way David did. So for me, this just was like an explosion in my mind that, wow, this really seems to be nothing more than stories that are being told and people saying a God told us, this and that. But it was, there's nothing more to it than just that. And so for me, it was really the lack of justice in the Bible that ultimately caused my faith to just come crumbling and crashing down. So anyhow, Gary, did you? I think you and I have maybe even discussed these two stories before, but it's for me, that moment was really so kind of pivotal in my my own beliefs. Sitting and comparing those two stories.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts?
Well, here's what I think. I think that King David was a very interesting individual. He's somebody who was not the most moral person in the world, but he wasn't the most evil. He's somebody who was the first king of Bethlehem, king of Israel. And was the first emperor. But I mean, I think it's going to show that even somebody who has good parts about them can do bad things. I think that's the whole point. Because, King David, as we know, started the city of Bethlehem. So it was important for that. But I think he's also shown that even if you're a good person, you will do things that are shitty. I mean, because even the best person that we know has done morally questionable things. I don't think I think that's the whole point, that Jesus is the only perfect person who's ever existed. Everyone else has tried to do good but does bad things because, they're the horny, or because, they think that somebody's going to betray them and they get jealous, or they get worried, or they get, angry or something like that. And I think that's the whole point. Hello? 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 Is it happening again?
I'm okay. I'm not muted now. I think I had accidentally muted myself.
Okay, sorry.
What I was going to say was that I can understand that good people do bad things, and that people who live pretty bad lives in general are capable of doing some things that are good. But that still doesn't address the question of whether or not a God was responsible, or the God of the Bible was actually responsible for divvying out their punishments and and then try and understand whether or not those punishments were fair or just. They were certainly kind of incommensurate, I think, with relative to each other, and also even just relative to the wrong that was done, in at least as it's accounted within those narratives.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the whole point of those narratives, is that people, even if they do, if they liberate a town or they liberate a city or they free people, can still do horrible things. I think it's trying to put over the story. Like, it's the whole thing of like Moses got angry with God because they were walking in the desert for so long. It's the same sort of thing. Is that man can be incredibly cruel and incredibly hateful, and then as soon as something doesn't go quite their way, they can turn on whatever their benefactor was. I think that's the whole point of those. I mean, you would say stories, I would say part historical narrative.
So was there punishment? Was Achan's punishment actually handed down by the God of the Bible, the Yahweh?
By Elohim,
or Elohim, if you want.
Okay. I think so. Yeah. I mean, like, because I think God was about punishing the wicked, and I don't see why not. But again, the thing is that David wasn't wicked, and that's the whole point. Is that he did things that were nefarious, yes, but wicked, no. Because you got to remember that what did the big thing he did, which was he was the founder of the city of Bethlehem, and therefore the whole thing is that he basically made something that was a shrine to God and basically a shrine to the good that God stood for. The fact is that he slept around a little bit and he had flaws, like we all do. I'm not going to stand here and say that I'm a perfect person. Hell is far from it. And I think anybody who says, "Oh, I'm a perfect person," is lying. Because we all have flaws, and I think that's the whole point of Jesus that comes later. Because, like, even though Jesus is a descendant of David, apparently, he's a descendant in David in the same way that we all are. That he's partly human. So, like, it's a whole It's a whole setup to Jesus coming along and showing us the right way to act. And I think that nobody say that that's the way that David did in those passages is the right thing to do.
Okay.
Or just the thing to do.
So would it be acceptable if our governments handed down judgments like David's and Achan's?
Probably not. But again, we have to. They're not Solomon, though. Solomon is the person who was the wise one, who did everything when it came to judgments right. I mean, like, the whole point of David is that he was a warrior king in the same way as, like, Alexander the Great or Napoleon or something like that. Or even something like Winston Churchill, if you will go to, like, more recent history, or something like, Rudy Giuliani or something like that. Somebody who was really good as when the city needed him to be a attacker, but when it came to the more boring kingly duties of being just and stuff like that, he wasn't so great in those areas.
Well, but the punishment that was handed down wasn't from David. It was supposedly from Elohim or Yahweh, the God of the Bible. So the punishment should be just.
It should, yes, but again, what would be just punishment? Again, you're playing like your own by the standards. But again, if he's condemned by God, therefore, or he's forsaken by God, that is a judgment in itself. Because again, you got to understand that this is before the modern concept of hell exists, or the separation from God exists, and that's punishment enough. Because again, if God forsakes you, or says that you're not good enough anymore, that's judgment enough. Especially for somebody who is following him. If for somebody who doesn't follow him, I'm sure that's inconsequential. But somebody who does it, forsaking God or God forsaking you is a big deal.
I can't. It seems like you're just kind of by-stepping the whole question of in one case a man and his entire family are slaughtered, are stoned to death by the whole community, or the whole nation, or at least their tribe, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And in the other case, the person, the perpetrator, doesn't even lose his throne, let alone the fact that his whole family. So that it just doesn't seem like there's any consistency there between the two punishments, and they both, in fact, David, when he was asked by, I think it was the prophet Nathan, he was given a hypothetical about stealing a sheep and whatever, and said, well, what, this person has many sheep, saying that, well, David has many wives, kind of analogous to that, but he steals a sheep from this man who only has one sheep that he loves dearly, and then he has the man killed on top of it, yada yada. He says, what should that man's punishment be who stole the sheep? And of course this is analogous, but David doesn't get it, and he says, well, that guy should be put to death. And it's not until Nathan calls him out that he actually confesses. And it's the same situation as far as being called out and then confessing. That was the same reaction that Achan had. Achan came clean and said, yeah, it's true, I stole these things, I beg your forgiveness, or whatever it was. That he admitted it at the very least. What? Why was one guy given a pass and the other guy's entire family had to pay the price?
Okay. Well, one of them was the king of Israel for a start. But on the one side, it's one person who asked him to confess. Now, the thing is that Nathan confessed on his own volition, if I remember rightly about the stories you're talking about. And the thing is that, do I think that's right? No. Again, you seem to think that I believe that these things were justly done by the Israel society at the time. I don't. It's the Israeli society that the way that they did things. Now, do I think that was the right way to act? No. I think if someone confesses, you should forgive them. But again, that is something that unfortunately does not come forward until Jesus exists. Unfortunately, and the Jews at the time were unfortunately very, what's the word, pluralistic in that if you did something wrong, you were affecting the tribe's, I don't know, the way that the tribe would function in general and would kill you. And this is very easy to see if you see things like rapists were allowed because they would get stoned, murderers were allowed because they would get stoned. It's throughout. Thieves. It doesn't matter whether you confessed or not. If you confess, that means that they were right to stone you in their society. Now the thing is that were you judged fairly by God is the actual question, and the question is yes. Now, do I think that this is a good legal system? Absolutely not.
Well, then also begs the question: well, what if this system was the system that was handed to them from Yahweh? Why wasn't it the absolute best system? With relative to human nature and just kind of the way we live. Why doesn't every culture and country look to the Bible for a guide on proper civil law and government structure, rather than to democracies and constitutional democracies as kind of the standard model for a just society?
because the Jewish society at the time wasn't a just society. It had to do what it had to do to survive. I mean, this is the thing that I think that most people don't understand or don't want to understand. This is a society that had to survive. It's this, what's the word? It's survival of the fittest. It's a very Darwinian thing. Of that, we're talking about a society that's pre-UN, that's pre-NATO, that's pre a lot of any sort of like saving force that had to basically be for itself, and that anybody who threatened that had to be removed. And while I do not agree with that, it's what they did to survive. Now, I don't believe that those laws you're talking about were passed down by God. I think that he wasn't so militaristic in that. Well, slavery is just a capital crime, because again, God's greatest punishment was not to kill you, because again, your life is always fleeting anyway. The biggest crime is to separate himself from you. That's the biggest punishment. So again, killing is just the removal of the life you have on Earth. The life you have after Earth is more important, especially in New and so in certain parts of the Old Testament, especially. That what comes after is as important as what's come before. And I think that the whole thing is that the Jewish society did what it had to do. When I said what it felt like it had to do. Sorry, let me rephrase. In order to go on, because again, if they didn't do that, then the Babylonians would smell weakness and be on them quicker than you can say, "Put goes the weasel," or some other society. Again, that's the thing that I don't think most people get, is that they judge you by today's society. It's like, it's really nice and really handy that you want to do that, but here's the problem. Back then, they didn't have the UN, they didn't have NATO, they didn't have anybody to say, "Hey, stop doing that, otherwise we'll come and protect them." It's like, it'd be really nice if that sort of thing existed, but unfortunately, it didn't.
Well, they had an all-powerful deity that had created the universe, right? I mean, that would be much more compelling to me. That if they had this kind of ideal government system that was fair and just, that was handed to them, that and that they stood as unique in history as having this, that they were able to maintain it, not by force of weapons and military strength, but just by the sheer presence of a protecting hand of a deity. If people came to attack them, maybe the deity lays them flat, or maybe they're just smitten by disease and things as they tried to attack the Israelites. I mean, that would be something.
God is not there to solve their problems for him. He's not a genie. He's there to try and give them the best direction possible to survive.
Well, but we're left looking at it, and it's indistinguishable as far as I can tell from a society where there really wasn't a deity, and it was just ideas that may have helped them survive, but no better or worse really than a lot of the other cultures, and in some cases actually decidedly worse, as far as some of the laws and things that they put into practice. And when you look at kind of the arc of history, we've developed superior ideas and practices that I think we've benefited from, but it's no different than, say, the development of science and technology that has helped us, and we can see different cultures have contributed in different ways, and these ideas have culminated into what we have today. But you don't need a divine explanation or a supernatural explanation for this. It's just kind of the way things happened historically.
Okay, but again, the thing is that God was not present then. The thing is that when God is present in the Bible, he usually manifests himself through an object, like he's either in a mountain or he's in a bush or he's doing something like that. So therefore, those are the rules that well, I personally as a Christian choose to follow. The Ten Commandments. No, I'm not saying that the laws that the Jews came up with were all bad. I'm just saying that they are what's the word? They're not exactly fitting with some of the things that we think now. Like for example, their rape laws were slightly poor because again, it didn't understand that somebody could be traumatized from being raped, and that's something that we do understand now.
Right. Yeah. I mean, who was it? I think it was either Michael Shermer or Steven Pinker pointed out that, for a man to have an unexpected encounter, a sexual encounter with a woman, is a lot less traumatic, and in a lot of cases, the man might even fantasize about that kind of thing or enjoy it, whereas a woman, uh, it's horrific because their whole idea of a positive sexual encounter is based on a relationship and based on character and comfort and all these things because um, their whole kind of evolutionary development has been based around the ability to raise children in a stable environment and things and have them provided for, which is the opposite of when you're raped. But anyways, when laws are created by male people, men, they don't take those ideas into account historically, or haven't taken them into account, and haven't understood how traumatic it is for a woman to be raped. We're kind of getting the idea now in the last several decades as kind of sociology and psychology have advanced, and women have become more vocal about those things and spoken more openly about it as well.
Here's a problem. Well, here's one of the main problems is that I've seen they're wrong when it comes to males like to be are fantasized by rape, because again, most males are as horrified by rape as women are, because men like to have positive, like what's it, body autonomy as well. And the thing is that the huge thing is that the Jews were going by what they understood at the time. They were going by the fact that they thought that a woman's silence connoted consent. Now, maybe they're wrong. Maybe they're right in some situations. Maybe they're right. They're wrong in some situations. Again, this is where nuance comes into play, because again, sometimes women being silent during sex is a perfectly natural thing. Sometimes, as I said, it isn't, and it's a part of the shock of being raped. And I think that's something that they could have known, but again, they wouldn't know about that until later, because that's a psychological thing.
Right, but if the laws were handed down by a deity, it seems, an omniscient deity, it seems like you would be able to accommodate and account for those things, and that they would be superior to, those are the things that I would expect. I mean, just like when with you can say, well, for example, the reason we don't see evidence of Bigfoot is because he does this and that, and you can explain all these things away, but at the end of the day, if there really is a creature like that, there are certain things that should be apparent, and you can explain them away, but without that evidence, it doesn't seem reasonable to accept and believe them. To me, it seems like having laws that took into account human nature and true justice, in a way that's superior to what other cultures had at the time, and even today. That, we would, if these really were inspired by an all-knowing God who was all just, we could look back on those and say, wow, that's, there was real true insight there. And instead it just seems like, well, this is just another culture that, was in this period of time in history, and that their laws weren't exceptional for that place in history and culture.
Well, here's the thing: is that I tend to think of the Ten Commandments as inspired by God. I don't tend to think of the Nicene Creed as being so, because that's just that's just the social laws they went by, which God didn't inspire. He did inspire the Ten Commandments, which were more the legal laws for the Jews use in practice. Now the thing is that a lot of people have problems with specific numbers of the Ten Commandments, for example.
Yeah, I mean, if there really is a God, I don't necessarily have a problem with the Ten Commandments. I just don't think that they're very useful for trying to create civil laws, and I think that there are also gaps. I mean, the fact that it doesn't say don't rape, the fact that it doesn't say don't enslave people, are two, I think, considerable omissions that should be there if if you're trying to come up with a list of important things around which your society should be based.
I would agree a lot. I think that thou should not be slaves. Have slaves should be there, but unfortunately, that's the way that their economic system worked. It's a bit like, you know what? For my own good, let me put you to really hard economic times. It's sort of like, because like the economic way it works, and this is really bad, is that if somebody had less money than somebody else, they would usually enthrall themselves to somebody else, and then they would work for that person for free. Well, not for free, but would work to pay off their debt. And just that's the way the economic system works. So I think that thou should not be slaves is something that Jesus said. So therefore, he knew he would say it later. Where it'd be much more, what's the word, open, because the Jewish society had changed.
Yeah.
Economically and stuff like that, because he was underneath the Roman rule. Everyone was swimming in loot at that time.
I don't know. It just doesn't seem very compelling to me. But I think I'm going to wrap it up. Do you want to make any final comments here, Gary? I've been on for probably almost 2 hours now. So
that's fine. That's fine. I'm probably going to go away and watch a video and stuff, and then try and see if I can make a gay video. That's it, really. I just came on here because I thought you were on, and I find you interesting to talk to.
Yeah, I was enjoying your conversation too.
Yeah, I mean, you're theologically different from me, because I think you come from, if I'm not mistaken, from a fundamentalist background.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I was raised. I don't know if you're familiar with the denomination, the Assemblies of God, but they're.
I am familiar with them. They have a church near me.
Okay. In the UK,
I'm very familiar with them.
Okay. I wonder what
they believe some very unusual things, shall we say?
Well, it's interesting though, and I don't want to go into this in a whole lot of detail, but even I was raised in the Assemblies of God in the northern United States, and my wife was raised in the Assemblies of God in the southern United States, and culturally within that denomination, there's considerable difference between, or at least there used to be when I was, our experiences growing up were very different, I think, and from what I've gathered from other people who grew up in the assemblies in the North versus the South. Just it's a different culture. The Northern Assemblies of God tended to be a bit less fundamentalist, like literal interpretation of the Bible, or at least open to a less literal interpretation. They insisted on the infallibility, but not necessarily inerrancy. But as you kind of go toward the South, it was much more rigid and conservative theologically in things.
Absolutely. I mean, the thing is that because I've gone through the changes I have, I mean, like, being in Britain, you tend not to be theologically fundamentalist anyway.
Sure.
I mean, there are definitely groups that are, but I'm not. I mean, I'm not fundamental about anything really. It's not really my personality type. But when I used to be an atheist, I wasn't fundamental then. Actually, that's probably one of the things that drove me away from it. Was the hypocrisy that I saw
among atheists, or
yeah, absolutely. Okay. Because like in one side in their mouths, they would say, "Oh, it's wrong that gay people are generalized and treated a certain way, treated like cabby queens and all this sort of stuff, and gay people are much more than that as like." And they should have civil rights and all this sort of stuff, and they should be treated like everybody else. I was like, yes, absolutely. But then as soon as a religious person came along, they would treat that person different. It's like, hang on a second. You can't hold that view and that view in the same breath. That's hypocrisy. It's a bit like me going, well, I like this person over here who's wearing red shoes, but that person over there who's wearing blue shoes. No, I can't have that. It's like, no, you just can't have that.
Yeah.
And I did. It was just like, if you're going to be this hypocrisy, I would know part of your. I mean, the thing is that in Christianity, the thing is that I see hypocrisy as well, but I'm more used to dealing with it now. It's just like when you grow up, hypocrisy doesn't bother you that much because as long as you're not hypocritical, I think that you're all right.
Yeah, well, and every group has people that are obnoxious and annoying, and you wish they were not had anything to do with the group that you also associate with, but they're there nonetheless. So what are you going to do? It's people.
Absolutely. So I mean, like, are you going to do any more discussions with Trey? Because I saw that one you did last night. Well, I went through half of it before I had to stop.
Yeah, we went. It was more rabbit holes than it was content related to the actual subject matter, but I think that's kind of typical for Trey. Yeah, I mean, I don't have any problem. Trey can get annoying in some cases just because I think he tends toward hubris and arrogance in some cases. That rubs me the wrong way, but the fact that he's willing to have the conversations, I think, is at least I appreciate that, because there are a lot of believers who won't even touch an actual discussion or conversation like that, and so I at least tip my hat to him for that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, like, I'm going to try and put a video to Godless Engineer because he made some errors that I have to address. But apart from that, I might do tomorrow a hangout or sometime this week anyway. Because did you see Deeper Than Dogma this week?
No, I haven't seen it yet. I'll probably listen tomorrow while I'm at work.
Okay. Well, it's talking about moderates. Now, I feel that I wasn't able to get on. I felt like responses needed. No, if you want to come along, then you're more than welcome.
Yeah, I'll check it out tomorrow, and tag me in a video if you do a response video too. I'm definitely interested in seeing that.
Okay, no problem.
All right, man. Well, I think I'm gonna stop the broadcast and probably hop off here.